Welcome to this short presentation on the COVID-19 pandemic and the potential impact that this event may have on students and families in our community. Please remember that this presentation is not exhaustive of all necessary information required to support our staff and students. But today we're going to be looking at the relationship between this public health crisis and trauma in the context of neurobiological and social impact, as well as the implications of what to expect next. To introduce myself, my name is Monica Ramager, and I am a licensed mental health counselor from New York State. I'm also a certified child and adolescent trauma provider, credentialed through the International Association of Trauma Professionals. I have over 6 years' experience working with children and adolescents in school, community, and residential settings. I also have experience creating and delivering trainings related to parenting, trauma, and crisis intervention. Today, I'm offering up my time on a voluntary basis to spread what I view as necessary and important information around the potential impact that this crisis may have on our students as we think about the reintegration back into schools once all of the isolation mandates have been lifted. This presentation is not intended to offer any training, and it's not intended to offer any therapeutic consultation. Instead, this presentation is intended to provide education and clarification on what to expect next for our students. I would like to thank my esteemed colleague, Jenna Malura, for also volunteering her time to peer review and edit this presentation to make it more accessible to school counseling and education staff. Thank you for joining me, and remember, this presentation does discuss trauma, so assess your level of engagement and take breaks as needed. When talking about any major social event, it's expected to have an overconsumption of media. Getting the news and obtaining information around COVID-19 almost feels inescapable, as social media, pop culture of all kinds have been permeated by this crisis. When assessing our news and social connection outlets, it's important to determine if the media we're consuming is healthy. Is it helpful? And of course, is it honest? Unfortunately, there is some misinformation being spread around COVID-19 that may lead to increased anxiety or panic in ways that are not rational or justified. How do we obtain information and share information in ways that feel safe and easy to manage? And how do we make sure that the information that our children and students are getting is accurate? Why do public health crises lead to trauma responses in our students? Unfortunately, there's minimal data on the connection between public health crisis and long-lasting traumatic events. However, research taken from the SARS epidemic that lasted from 2002 to 2004 showed that the populations most significantly impacted had a 29% increase in rates of reported PTSD and 31% increase in rates of reported depression. In order to understand why these changes happen, we have to assess the social impacts of COVID-19. As of today, over 1 billion students worldwide are unable to go into their schools or universities. Most districts, especially within our country, are finding what we call stopgap solutions to continue teaching, such as using online instruction. However, it's important to note that this learning is very heavily dependent on access to supports, such as reliable computers and internet. And knowing that the world is only 60% online, it's possible that some of our students will not have reliable access to computers, the internet, and most of the learning material being provided. There are other significant social impacts. The most talked about in the current media is the loss of jobs and subsequent financial insecurity. 6.6 million Americans applied for unemployment just last week. The loss of jobs and financial insecurity are going to have significant impacts on our students' abilities to get their needs met, to maintain housing, food, clothing, to maintain access to internet and computers. And it's important to understand, as can be expected, loss of job and financial security can lead to significant increases in stress and conflict within our families. Furthermore, the vast majority of our students do live in homes that are violent, abusive, and neglectful. There is a necessity that we identify which of our students live in violent households and communities. There's going to be extended exposure during this time, and while that may seem comparable to summer, the high-stress situation is going to have a lot more implications than a typical school break. At least a few of our children will be forced to stay in home environments that are unsafe and unproductive. In addition, a lot of our families will be experiencing food shortages, both due to financial reasons and also due to just public panic buying, as well as a general limitation of sources available. Some families may experience what's called food insecurity, which is the fear and worry about accessing food when needed. Food insecurity is significantly attached to anxiety, eating disorder behaviors, and other mental health concerns. Isolation and loneliness is another serious aspect of COVID-19 that we need to address. All of our students will be experiencing a sense of disconnection from their peers and a sense of seclusion and isolation in their homes. And a lot of our students, especially our upperclassmen, are going to be missing out on long expected and anticipated events. Plays, foreign exchanges, proms, sport seasons, internships. These losses are going to only exacerbate those feelings of loneliness. Furthermore, given the overrun nature of our medical system right now, we in general are going to expect poor or limited medical care, except for those who have the most acute, chronic, or serious health needs. And then, of course, there's the risk for illness and death. It's expected that at least some of our students will experience the direct effects of the coronavirus complications that can lead to serious sickness or death. And finally, the social impact of COVID-19 that's going to be most significant and long-lasting is increased mental health needs and an increase in health anxiety. And it makes sense why all of these social impacts would lead to trauma responses. Fear of job loss, fear of death, anxiety about uncertain future, lack of social support, the discomfort of being trapped inside. And that SARS epidemic study found that the longer the quarantine, the stronger the traumatic outcomes. In a crisis of this size, there's going to be an intersectionality between pre-existing conditions and consequences of this event. The people who fall into any of these 5 categories are going to have compounded effects from the coronavirus consequences. To start, people who have physical health needs, pre-existing illness or injury, require frequent visits to medical centers that expose our families and our students to the virus at a higher risk. Furthermore, chronic illness and injury needs may not get the appropriate support and care they need during this time, as our system is currently saturated with fixing and curing and treating those affected by the virus. Individuals with mental health needs are also going to be at significantly higher risk for future complications. Health anxiety is on the rise. We're seeing an increase in OCD compulsions around hand washing, fear of germs and other germ-related behaviors. We're also seeing an increase in agoraphobia, which is the direct fear of leaving your house. Depression will be compounded, given feelings of isolation, hopelessness, immobility. And it's necessary to report that our students who have histories of suicidal behavior or suicidal ideation are going to be at a much higher risk of future suicide attempts. Because people feel trapped, these types of environmental situations breed addictive behaviors as minimal other coping skills feel accessible. And then finally, both anecdotally in my own clinical work, as well as information that's been reviewed online, there is significant impact in eating disorder regression and relapse, just given the strong association right now between being trapped inside and access to food. Furthermore, our families with economic and financial needs before the crisis are going to be hit the most markedly, as they tend to have fewer assets and resources to assist in the terrible event of losing a job. Students who live in homes with high family conflict and low safety needs are also going to be hit the most markedly during this time. Word from state police is unless significant violence is reported, they are being told not to respond to domestic disputes as a way to reduce the spread of the virus. Furthermore, some county mobile crisis units are also not responding to home calls. And so what we're going to end up seeing, as is already reported, an increase in family conflict and violence, and a decreased access to safety needs. There is already reports and worry about significant increases in domestic violence and limited access to shelters or support. And then finally, our students who have trauma histories, even traumas completely unrelated to the environmental stressors that we have already discussed, are going to be at higher risk for further damage, given the compounding effect of trauma that we'll get into in a moment. So let's just take a moment before we dive into the relationship between public health and trauma and identify the specific outcomes from this event that we should be expecting. The most devastating, of course, is death. The immediate death of a family member or community member is going to have a significant impact on our students in school at large. And the limited social support that can be offered around death is going to compound and complicate our students' grief. We're also looking at chronic illness that can be worsened during this time. People who have pre-existing lung, autoimmune, or other high-risk disorders may have a change or stoppage of their care, or might have their illness be worsened by infection of the virus. As previously discussed, there's also going to be exposure to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, extreme family conflict, parents who need to continue going to work but maybe cannot afford child's care, might be leaving their kids at home unsupervised in a way that is not safe or supportive. And then, of course, there's the loss of income and the increase in poverty. And we need to be mindful that some of our students may not be getting their basic needs met during this time of isolation. And because of loss of income, we're also seeing increased risk for homelessness or home disruption. Even though the government is currently putting protections into place around eviction, late fees, and other rent protections, most of our families may not know that those mandates are in place and are at risk of being taken advantage of people who do not follow recommendations from the government. Of course, we're going to have lack of appropriate medical care, even for minor ailments. Our families are not going to be able to receive the same amount of medical support that they would have otherwise, which is going to impact their functioning. we're also going to see a triggering of trauma symptoms, even for our students who have recovered or partially recovered. There's a chance that those trauma symptoms are going to return, worsen, or be compounded by others. And then, of course, we see relapse in addictive behaviors, gambling, shopping, and eating disorder behaviors. As previously discussed, a lot of our community members feel trapped. And even if it's our students directly that are not impacted by relapsing behaviors, having a parent or other adult or other same age sibling in the household struggle with substance use, disordered eating, and other addictive behaviors is a form of trauma that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then finally, we have racial and xenophobic responses, especially among those of the Asian American descent. Be very mindful of any families in your community who come from China or other Asian countries who are at most risk of being targeted by racial slurs, insults, and threats. There are some less acute ways that our families may be impacted by the crisis. It's important to identify that not all of our families and students exist within the lowest socioeconomic class. Despite that, we are seeing an increase of health anxiety in general, transcending all demographics. Peer isolation also transcends all demographics and can have an impact on behavior, self-esteem, and connectedness. We might find that our students are having an inability to focus on assigned work. Maybe they don't have access. Maybe they don't have motivation. Limited accountability because their parents are still at work. And there will be poor information retention. They're going to struggle to retain the information that was learned right before the pandemic. And they're going to struggle to retain the information that they are, in essence, teaching themselves over the coming weeks. And of course, there will be regression to previous behaviors or symptoms. Our brains have a deeply embedded memory recall system that when we are hit with times of crisis, it's kind of like it goes to your last save point and says, hey, remember when this made us feel better? Let's try that again right now. And finally, shortage of home and health supplies. Even for people who still get their basic needs met, we can expect that there is going to be a decrease in comfort and quality of life during this time, which can lead to feelings of frustration and anger. And then at a minimum, even our students and families that fare well through this pandemic and come out with minimal impact, there are still some aspects that will touch every family. Mild health anxiety, difficulty transitioning back to previous routines, kids that already struggle with school avoidance, school refusal, are not going to want to come back to school. And I think that it's important that we recognize that. There's also some confusion around media messages, boredom, increased frustration. And then that boredom and increased frustration may lead to an over-reliance on technology and gaming systems that almost have an addictive quality that are going to be very hard to wean our students off of. We might see some control-seeking behaviors, increased argumentation, increased opposition and defiance. And then finally, impaired sleep. Now that we understand the negative impact of this pandemic, it's necessary that we take some time to talk about what trauma is, both in the context of this specific event and in the context of adverse childhood experiences. And adverse childhood experiences are pre-existing in our populations of students and families, regardless of how aware we are of them. The definition of trauma is one that seems to be changing every day. Most professionals say it's a psychological and emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. It's important to remember that the trauma is not the event, but it is the response in our body and brain to the event. It's called trauma because just like physical trauma implies damage, emotional trauma also implies damage. And when talking about the types of traumatic events, some students find it helpful to split them into what we call big T's versus little t's. Big T's refer to large, acute, significant moments of trauma, such as grief, loss, violence, or abuse. It usually only takes one big T to lead to a traumatic response in the brain. Little t's, on the other hand, refer to microtraumas or small moments of stress. Bullying, comments about the body, moments of rejection, parental conflict could all be classified as little t's. If a child is exposed to multiple little t's, there's a higher risk of a trauma response. It's also helpful to view trauma in the context of what we call toxic stress. And toxic stress is a response that can occur when a child experiences strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity without adequate adult support. But of course, not all stress is bad, and it should be identified that often anxiety can be a very helpful body response. But, as with trauma, it is not the stressful event that determines toxicity. It is the body's response to that stressful event. And when a child's exposure to stress is not moderated by support and compassion, they never learn to regulate and de-escalate from moments of hyperarousal. This leaves toxic levels of stress hormones unregulated in their body. The specific aspects of that physiological damage will be processed in a moment. So, what complications can occur as the result of a trauma response in the brain or body? Different types of trauma-based disorders can impact development and functioning. Complex trauma is when a child experiences many events repeatedly in a close proximity of time. Each new experience of trauma increases the risk of detrimental effects, almost like they add on top of each other. Developmental trauma is when events take place in the first 3 years of life. The early exposure to trauma greatly impacts emotional, social, and cognitive development. These two types of trauma complications are markedly important to identify during this time. Children who have already been exposed to events of trauma will have their risk increased during this pandemic. In addition, there are many children in our communities under the age of 3 right now who just from this moment in our history are going to be at risk of developmental trauma. And those children will eventually be moving up into our districts. Not only do we need to be aware of the kids that we have now, but we also need to be aware of the kids that we're going to have moving forward. When we talk about trauma as a diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder is the combination of multiple distressing and chronic symptoms relating to the experience of a trauma event. These symptoms include avoidance, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and frequent trauma reminders. But trauma is subjective. Some students may have no physiological damage or negative response to this event. But other students are going to have subjective experiences that are much more intense and much more significant. The final piece about trauma and toxic stress is that there are levels of exposure that are necessary and sufficient to lead to the expression of symptoms. The first level of exposure is direct. The trauma event happened to me or in my immediate environment that caused a moment of fear or disturbance that I was unable to cope with. The thing happened to me. But the trauma response can also come from hearing about other people's traumatic events. The stress response system in our brain does not do a very good job of assessing where we're getting our fearful information from, and so it interprets messages of threats the same, whether it's happening to us or we're hearing about the experience. And this is especially true if our stress response systems are not very strong. And so, overconsumption of media and seeing the detrimental impact that this crisis has on the world can create PTSD-like symptoms in our students. But to even take one more step away from that, toxic stress symptoms can also be expressed solely from having fearful thoughts that the event could happen. This means that our kids and families who have significant anxiety and worry may develop symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder simply because they are so afraid that it might happen. These things are going to be very important for us to be aware of when we deal with our students' return to school. So when I say ACEs, I would like to take a moment and process what that is. An ACE is an adverse childhood experience. The most significant source of data on the impact that trauma has on development comes from the ACEs study conducted by Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente and the associated researchers identified 10 trauma events that increase the risk of negative physical, social, emotional, and behavioral development. These 10 trauma events are physical violence, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse. Physical neglect, which is my necessary and basic needs are not met. And emotional neglect, I do not have a trusting, caring adult checking in with me and helping me regulate my big feelings. And then exposure to parental mental illness, exposure to incarcerated relatives, exposure to domestic violence, exposure to family substance use, and then divorce. It's very easy to see how the COVID-19 pandemic will increase all 10 of these adverse childhood experiences. But what does that mean for our students? There was a large epidemiological study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. 17,000 adults were surveyed about their experiences with trauma in childhood, and the results were astounding. In fact, these results were so significant that it changed the entire landscape of mental health. They determined that the more ACEs a child has before the age of 18, the more significant the risk for developing physical, mental, and social disorders. What they ended up finding is that 2/3 of our population experience at least one trauma event before the age of 18. And 1/5 of our population experience at least 3 or more trauma events before the age of 18. And the fact that there's a dose-response relationship means the more ACEs, the more risk. And the more risk, the more odds are that they will be exposed to future ACEs. And so the results of this study found that ACEs lead to negative unhealthy behaviors with limited impulse control and a limited ability to plan around consequences. Also, ACEs lead to physical health, obesity, heart disease, cancer. And then, of course, ACEs lead to mental health, depression, substance use. One source of data found that people who experience 4 or more ACEs in childhood are 1,200 times more likely to attempt suicide than those who've experienced 1 or fewer ACEs. And that's very significant for our students. Why is this relevant? Well, current national data suggests that 72% of children experience at least one adverse childhood event before the age of 18. So this means 72% of our students who are currently isolated at home during this pandemic have already been exposed to at least one trauma. After this pandemic is over, it is not unrealistic to say 100% of our students will have been exposed to at least one moment of trauma. Our current environmental issues are going to exacerbate the risk of those trauma events in our students moving forward. When considering what I mean when I say risk for our students in the development of negative symptoms, we must equally consider their environment and their genetic vulnerability. One model that looks at this relationship is the diathesis stress model. Diathesis just means genetic vulnerability, or the genes that we get from our family. And stress just refers to environmental messages that are overwhelming or stressful. This model posits that a child's risk in developing a condition is higher when their genetic vulnerability is higher. It also says that the more stress a person has, the more chance there is to develop negative symptoms. This model really looks at the balance between nature and nurture and how that balance impacts the development of conditions. The diathesis stress model says the combination of high genetic vulnerability and high environmental stress leads to the most significant expression of negative symptoms. But it's also important to identify that even if you have low genetic risk, as our environmental stress goes up, so does the risk of developing negative symptoms. And I think it's fair to say that all of our environmental stress is going up. According to Bessel van der Kolk, who is a renowned trauma expert, there are certain experiential factors that increase the risk for trauma responses in the body. These factors include a lack of predictability, immobility or the perception of being helpless, loss of connection, a loss of sense of time, a loss of safety, and a loss of sense of purpose. And finally, trauma events tend to lead to behaviors for numbing or spacing out to manage the emotional intensity. These factors specifically describe the current conditions within the pandemic right now. The pandemic itself will be considered a traumatic event for every member of our community. The pandemic has created such significant life transitions that must be expected to impact the coping skills of the general population. All biopsychosocial functioning of our individual students and community at large will be impacted by this experience. We can no longer say that trauma is not relevant in schools. So, we know that trauma experiences have significant impacts on how the brain responds to trauma, and we will talk in significant depth in a moment about what that looks like. But what does this have to do with learning? Well, effective learning requires advanced cognitive ability, trust in adults, and organizational skills. These are all functions that come from our frontal lobe, the most targeted area when we're talking about trauma. A traumatic event can impact a child's ability to learn by altering the brain, impacting mental health and behavioral development, and can increase the risk of developing unhealthy coping skills. It is vital as educators, support staff, and administrators that we're aware of what cognitive challenges our students may face following this event. To further grasp the complexity of effective learning, let's look at all the cognitive skills that are necessary. We need well-defined skills associated with language, communication, memory, attention, multitasking and planning, time management, organization, reading, writing, math, abstract thought, insight, help-seeking, and problem-solving. An impairment in any one of these areas can lead to a significant impact on a student's ability to learn. So, let's talk about the brain. I want to be clear during this section of our presentation to acknowledge that my descriptions of neurological functioning are very simplified. I do not mean to imply that any of these cognitive and neuronal processes are simple, predictable, or absolute. However, general patterns of understanding around brain function can help us understand how trauma responses are necessary aspects of maladaptive brain development. But first, let's consider typical brain development. For the sake of our presentation today, we have three main parts of the brain to focus. Evolutionary speaking, the brainstem is the oldest part of the brain. You may refer to it as the animal brain or reptilian brain. Basically what it means is it developed first. And the brainstem is also the simplest in that we have very minimal control over its functioning. The brainstem controls arousal and automatic responses associated with survival and keeping our bodies alive. The limbic region evolved next, and this includes the amygdala, or the brain's smoke detector, which is what helps us determine if there's a safety threat, as well as the hippocampus. It connects the high and low parts of the brain, and it's responsible for the experience and expression of emotion and memory. And then finally, the cortex. The cortex is the most complex, and it's really what separates us as human beings, given the level of complexity to its functioning. It allows a person to reflect. It's the area for cognition and thinking. And the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain involved with concentration, higher brain functions. Of all the learning skills we just identified as necessary, they all take place in at least one of these three essential areas of brain. It's important for these three brain areas to work together to be the most effective. But it's also important that these three brain areas are well developed. In elementary years, the child develops motor skills, visual motor coordination, reasoning, language, social understanding, and memory. Here, learning is consolidated into neural networks, and these concepts combine into meaningful units that are available for later use. The ability to generalize and apply messages from their surroundings begin at this stage and continue into adulthood. During this time, the children learn about social interaction, social norms, and these skills are closely tied to the development of the right hemisphere and areas of the brain associated with emotional processing, aka the limbic system. Later elementary years and early middle school years, we show an increase in the development of the child's brain, most associated with the posterior regions, or areas for auditory, visual, and tactile functioning. This intersection of areas is called the association area of the brain, and it is generally used to store information built up from sensory experiences. This is the information most often measured when conducting achievement tests. And then in the time of adolescence, they are expected to think about consequences to change their behaviors, but this is also a time where our students are most risk-prone and impulsive. This risk-seeking tendency usually declines at a rapid pace in the development of healthy individuals. These healthy teens become much better in their ability to control methods of reaction, such as fighting or verbal aggression, and they start using behaviors that are more adaptive, such as communication and understanding. Adolescents and young adults start to see others, and they become better at relating. Their progress towards independence is exciting but challenging. As you saw in the previous slide, the frontal lobe develops at every stage of learning. When we talk about the frontal lobe of the brain, it matures more fully into middle school, and then this maturation continues through high school and into adulthood, with some estimates that the frontal lobe develops all the way up to ages 25 to 28. The frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex allow humans to evaluate and adapt from past experiences. The more positive past experiences you have to pull from, the more adaptive your coping skills will be. The frontal lobe is thought to be where social understanding and empathy reside. The development of the white matter in this region is crucial for higher cognitive functioning and adaptive social behavior. Neuronal tracts develop in an orderly fashion, and they experience swift developmental changes as this part of the brain is highly plastic and highly sensitive to environmental messages. This information is necessary because the frontal lobe development has an impact on so many social, academic, and behavioral needs associated with learning, even in a healthy brain with minimal history or impairment. Exposure to toxic stress or trauma responses at any age has serious implications for the damage of optimal brain functioning. And so, what actually causes the damage associated with a trauma response? Well, that's where our nervous system comes in. The central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, or peripheral nervous system, are the two main sources of control in the body. The ANS is most important for two situations. In emergencies that causes stress and requires us to take action, or in non-emergencies that allows us to what we call rest and digest. The autonomic nervous system regulates functions of our internal organs, such as the heart, stomach, and intestines. It's a part of the peripheral nervous system, and it also controls some of the muscles in our body. It controls the muscles most associated with reflexes, or muscles that move without our conscious awareness. The ANS functions involuntarily and reflexively, and this concept is going to be repeated given the importance it plays in how our children respond to trauma outside of their control. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into three branches: the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and the enteric. The sympathetic nervous system is all about activation. The sympathetic nervous system gets us prepared for survival, and it does so by relaxing the bladder and digestive systems, pulling blood away from unnecessary survival areas of the brain and body, speeding up the heart rate, speeding up our blood pressure, dilating our pupils, and helping us focus on the stressor. The parasympathetic division does the opposite by calming us down out of our stress response and maintaining normal body function to conserve physical resource. The parasympathetic slows our heart rate, constricts our pupils, and brings us back to a state of rest. And then the third is the enteric nervous system, which is confined to the gastrointestinal tract. This is important because oftentimes our students will identify body sensations associated with nausea, stomach pain, diarrhea, and other gastrointestinal issues. And that's because our enteric system is directly associated to our stress response system. As one is activated, the other is deactivated, and we can feel those changes happening in our body. The autonomic nervous system operates by receiving information from the environment and from other parts of the body. And then the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems try to have opposing options. That way, one stimulates a response and the other inhibits it. This keeps us in a state of equilibrium. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with the fight or flight response, as well as the release of our stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. In minor amounts, our stress hormones are safe and adaptive. They send messages in our body to prepare us for certain levels of survival. The parasympathetic nervous system then puts the brake on our stress system, and our body stops releasing those chemicals and shifts back towards relaxation, digestion, and regeneration. They are meant to work in rhythmic alternation that supports healthy digestion, sleep, and immune system. Imagine you're in the woods and you see a bear. Your autonomic nervous system is going to instantly activate the moment your social engagement system identifies that that bear is a threat. Blood and oxygen move away from our prefrontal cortex and away from any non-threat related physiological characteristics. And then your body is going to scan your brain, and based on your specific history of arousal, your body has a reflex to either go into fight, flight, or freeze, and it does this automatically. This neurological response is absolutely necessary to survive in times of real danger. So what is the stress response? Well, fight is the sympathetic activation of muscle tensing, muscle reflexive responding, and approach towards the threat in an attempt to fight. However, when we cannot fight, we try to flee. And what happens here is the blood then moves to different muscles in our body that allow us to escape safely. This is accompanied by faster, deeper breathing, tensing and increased blood flow to the heart and muscles, and increased blood flow to the brainstem. When we're unable to fight and we're unable to flee, the next thing that we do is we freeze, like a deer caught in the headlights. This is an inborn impulse that turns our sensory organs towards the stressor, and the goal here is to stop, look, and listen. Your pupil will dilate, and freeze occurs in preparation for action. But when no action can be pulled from our brain, we stay there. The faint response is even more significant in that the faint response can trigger vasovagal syncope, which is basically vagus nerve dysregulation that promotes nausea, loss of bowel control, vomiting, and fainting. And so our kids who have the most impaired stress response system, all of the safety messages in their life they've never been able to fight against, they've never been able to flee from, and they've never been able to stay safe and freeze, will fall into faint. Two additional stress response outcomes that are less studied than the first four are fright and flag. And so fright is what happens when the first four do not restore safety for our students. There is no escape from the threat, and fright takes over with feelings of panic, lightheadedness. The stage is considered to have dual autonomic activation, which means there is abrupt and disjointed alterations between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It is in this stage that we see symptoms of dissociation. And dissociation is the student, child, or adult's separation from reality in an attempt to keep themselves safe. And then finally, there's flag. If your body has cycled through every possible stress resource and you still do not feel safe, we have system shutdown and immobilization. This phase is dominated by dissociative reactions. Voluntary actions such as speech become difficult, sounds become distant, our vision blurs, and we feel numb. The heart rate and blood pressure drop. But the stress response should hopefully return us to a stable state of rest and digest. Rest and digest can only happen when we are calm, cool, collected, and connected. So, how do our students develop stress responses? A term coined by Dr. Dan Siegel is now commonly used to understand and describe the normal brain-body reactions, especially following adversity. This concept suggests that there is an optimal arousal level, Because again, some anxiety is good. Anxiety motivates us to action. Anxiety increases focus. Anxiety shuts off some physiological systems that are not necessary for the task at hand. And so, this optimal arousal level allows for some ebb and flow, ups and downs of emotions that are experienced generally by all human beings. We can experience hurt, anxiety, pain, and anger that maybe bring us close to our edges of the window, but generally we're able to utilize calming and coping strategies to keep us moderated. However, when a student has experienced adversity through trauma and unmet needs, this drastically disrupts our nervous system. Our senses are heightened, our experiences and reactions are intensified, and coping strategies are less readily available to us. Adverse experiences literally shrink our window of tolerance, meaning we have less capacity to ebb and flow, and we have a greater tendency to become overwhelmed more quickly. What that means is it does not take much to throw these students into a state of hyperarousal or hypoarousal. When we're in our window, we want that calm arousal. It's ideal and it's most useful throughout the day. However, when we become overstimulated by, say, fear, pain, anger, trauma triggers, and others, it pushes us up out of our window into hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is characterized by excessive activation and energy in the form of anxiety, panic, fear, hypervigilance, and emotional flooding. Your body wants to fight or run away all the time. You feel anxious, angry, out of control, and overwhelmed. And these reactions just take over because if you remember, our autonomic nervous system controls our body like a reflex. Just like you would not expect a student to be able to slow their heart rate down, you should not expect a student to be able to pull themselves back into their window of tolerance without adequate support. When we are hyper-aroused, our system is stuck on, and it impacts our ability to relax, often making it difficult to sleep, eat, and digest food, or optimally manage our emotions. At the most intensified level of hyperarousal, we may see what's called dissociative rage. On the other end of the spectrum, hypoarousal can occur when we have been hyperaroused for too long and our body cannot manage it, or when emotional numbing, sadness, or feelings of hopelessness are so significant that it plunges us down out of our window into what's called hypoarousal. When we have surpassed the pain and emotional overwhelmedness that our body is able to tolerate, we plunge into a state of shutdown. In this state, our system can become stuck off, characterized by exhaustion, depression, flat affect, numbness, disconnection, dissociation. And this too impacts our sleep in that we may want to sleep all the time. It impacts our appetite and digestion, and it may make us feel emotionally deadened. Hyperarousal is associated with fight and flight. Hypoarousal is associated with freeze or faint. And calm arousal is associated with rest and digest. So we know that the stress response is helpful when we're walking in the woods and we see a bear. Unfortunately, our kids with trauma have brains that see bears everywhere. They are hardwired for fear. They have less attuned calming responses, and they have impaired autonomic nervous functioning that maintains control over unhealthy arousal levels. When a child grows up afraid or under constant or extreme stress, the immune system and body stress response systems may not develop normally. And then later on, when that child or adult is exposed to even regular levels of stress, these systems automatically respond as if the individual is under immediate threat. So for example, the student may experience significant physiological reactivity such as rapid breathing or heart pounding, or may even shut down entirely when presented with a stressful situation as simple as answering a question in class, completing a different homework assignment, or dealing with peer conflict. These responses are adaptive when faced with significant threat, but they're out of proportion in the context of normal stress. Dr. Dan Siegel refers to this phenomenon as flipping your lid. There's a great way to use your hand as a model of the brain, as shown on this image, to describe what happens when a child has a feeling of stuck in a negative emotion or response. The inner brain stem, our limbic system, is turned on, and that prefrontal cortex is turned off. In the wake of trauma, a child's cortex is disconnected. And if you remember, the cortex is the part of our brain that holds all of those necessary learning skills. The emotional parts of the brain run the show, and higher level thinking is not accessible by the child. Living in a fear-activated state of hyper-awareness causes a child to be quick to anger. This is their subconscious effort to self-protect. And while it might be viewed as defiant, disrespectful, aggressive, disruptive, it is their brain's attempt to survive in the only way that it's ever known how. On the other side, children might be seen as shutting down, but what their brain is saying, you need to stay safe, and I'm going to do the best I can. This has come to be called flipping your lid. And when a child is in this elevated state, using language may not be an effective tool to help them calm down and self-regulate. And so we will talk about other tools that can be useful for our kids who flip their lids all day. We spent a lot of time today talking about our brain and trauma. Trauma turns our typical brain functioning upside down. In a typical brain development, the more you use an area of the brain, the more highly attuned that brain development is. So for example, typical development says that we should not really have to think much about survival. If our environment is supportive and safe and accessible enough, we don't even have to think about survival. If we have good regulation skills and co-regulation skills from trusted adults in our families, we don't really need to think about regulation. And when we feel a nice, solid social emotional connection, we don't really have to think about that either, which frees up so much cognitive resources on those necessary aspects of learning. Students of trauma do not have those same experiences. So much of their brain is centered on survival that when we get to the top of the pyramid, there's hardly anything left for cognition. The more the child's brain has to focus on survival, even from threats that are not real, the less resources that child has for complex executive brain functioning. The way that trauma influences brain development will be different from each kid. Just as each child will have different emotional responses, they'll also have different neurological responses. Some of the things that we do see, though, is an overactive amygdala, which is designed to detect and react to people. This is important for safety and survival. However, after trauma, the amygdala can become even more highly attuned to potential threats, leading a child to have to closely monitor surroundings, what we see as hypervigilant, and strong emotional reactions to things that may be threatening to keep them safe. This heightened attention to potential threats in the environment can make it hard for children to pay attention in school, go new places, or interact with people they don't know. Furthermore, the prefrontal medial cortex helps control activity of the amygdala, and it's involved in learning. Connections between this prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are sometimes not as strong in children who've experienced trauma. As a result, the prefrontal cortex is not as effective of telling the amygdala, hey, we are safe. And we never get those safe responses from our cortex, meaning the amygdala continues to fire, which leads to persistent elevations in fear and anxiety. Furthermore, the amygdala continues to call for the release of adrenaline and cortisol. And studies show that excessive levels of adrenaline and cortisol can actually damage and kill parts of the brain and have toxic effects on different organs and body systems. The more stressful chemicals you have, the more it feels like poison in your body. And then, of course, the hippocampus is involved in learning and memory. And when the hippocampus is impaired by these toxic hormones in the body, we see impairments in learning and memory. So the child struggles to learn material, then that child struggles to translate learned material to long-term memory, and then they struggle to retrieve that learned material from their long-term memory into their working memory space. Ability to learn and remember information about the surrounding environment becomes much more important to children who've experienced trauma than it is to learn about the information being taught by the teacher. These children experience harmless situations as scary. They see bears everywhere. So what do we do about this? Before we get into how we address the needs of our students, let's spend some time talking about how to take care of yourself. The use of self-care during isolation can help you manage your own difficult feelings during this time. You are all people before you are professionals, and you may find that some of the issues previously discussed relate to you or people in your own family. So make sure you're taking time to attend to your needs as we prepare for a return to normalcy. First, of course, it's important to follow the CDC standard for health precautions, such as social distancing, avoiding any non-essential travel, and making sure that you're keeping yourself and your environment sanitized. It's also important to take breaks from consuming news media updates around the pandemic to limit anxiety. It's suggested that you stick to one or two reliable resources and that you keep yourself contained to only checking those resources once or twice a day at most. It's also important that we stay connected to our support systems. Video chatting with people at least twice a day is super helpful because we see that the benefits for social contact for our mental health is vast. And checking in on loved ones can help you feel more secure about things that maybe you're anxious about. So connecting with support through FaceTime or other video messaging systems can be very helpful. When possible, get outside to get some sunshine, fresh air, movement. Banish boredom by sticking to a schedule, but also allow for flexibility, leisure, and moments of relaxation. Plan around regular meals and exercise to keep your body regulated with your internal clock of what lunchtime, dinner time, breakfast time, and sleep time are. Make time for what I call productive unproductivity. Do things that you like just because you like them. Reading, creating, meditating, relaxation, and of course mindfulness. And practicing mindfulness will not only be beneficial for you and your families, but it'll eventually be beneficial as you move back into schools and you have your own set of coping skills to help you stay calm in the face of coming conflict. And finally, remember why you're doing this. If you are watching this presentation today, there's a part of me that can assume you are dedicated to the needs of your students. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Staying connected, even from a distance, can help decrease feelings of loneliness and isolation. Find creative ways to connect with friends and family, as we discussed, through media, distanced public meetings, and virtual game nights. When connecting with your colleagues, make sure that you have open communication lines with your superiors. Educators and your support staff should also be connected within the school system. And then, of course, Finding ways to stay connected with your students is so important to help maintain relationships and ease some of their anxiety. It's also important to identify additional resources for modes of communication to improve the ability to stay in touch for students who have barriers. Letters, emails, phone calls, and video check-ins would all benefit our students greatly. We learn that trauma changes our brain, but thankfully these changes in the brain are not permanent. The brain is remarkably plastic, meaning that it changes in response to social and environmental experience. This helps us learn, form relationships with people, and develop new skills. And changes in the brain that happen after trauma can improve over time. But in order for our students to recover from post-traumatic brain disruption, they need to have safe, stable, and supportive relationships. When we're talking about trauma, we must focus on relationship maintenance, especially for our students who are the most vulnerable. The single most common factor for children who develop resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. Resiliency is the ability to endure difficult and stressful events with minimal or no traumatic outcomes. And if that's what we want for our students and for ourselves, we must build resiliency. And in order to do that, we need supportive adult and child relationships. We need to help students build a sense of self-efficacy and perceived control. And we need to provide opportunities to strengthen adaptive skills and self-regulatory capacities. And we want to mobilize resources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. For some of our most disconnected family, these sources of resiliency may come from school alone. Relationships provide our students with protection, feelings of acceptance, feelings of trust, and comfort in asking for help. And we want our students to be able to ask us for help. And they also build key capacities to monitor and regulate behavior. These skills can help children respond better in adversity. And these relationships during a time of crisis can be an important first step at stopping further negative behaviors. Use this presentation today to open up modes of communication among your district on how you can improve the process of maintaining connections and relationships to each of our students and families. Though it may not feel like it, we will eventually return to normalcy. While we cannot predict what life will be like after this pandemic, there are ways we can prepare for transition. It's important to remember that children look to adults for guidance on how to react to stressful events. If you, as the adult, find yourself struggling with difficult emotions, anxiety, and stress management, it is safe to assume that our kids and students are going to have similar or more intense responses. Use this time as a tremendous opportunity for adults to model to students how to be flexible and compassionate as we all work through adjusting our daily schedules. Try to prepare students and families ahead of time with what the return may look like. In addition, make plans with your colleagues and other school personnel about how to handle expected difficulties. And make sure that you, as the adult, are managing your own needs and worries. And finally, expect regression. This event will impact every single student who returns to your building, and the more we anticipate needs, the less overwhelmed and frustrated we will be. Any anxiety and worry that comes from this is expected and should be normalized as much as possible. For all children that return, it will be beneficial to encourage them to verbalize their thoughts and feelings. When it comes to reestablishing a school routine, it's important to remember a few key concepts. And I want to be clear in this part of the presentation. I am not an educator. There are complications and complicated structural coordination that needs to take place within schools that I do not have the information on. What I do have information on, however, is a vast resource of knowledge around trauma-informed educational practices that have been in use across the country and have shown significant impact and negative school behaviors and impaired academic functioning. It can only be assumed that moving forward after this pandemic, that these strategies will be more relevant than ever. First, we must be patient. When it's time to return to school, the shift will result in an increase in school anxiety and avoidance. And each child is different in their reaction to schedule, so it's important that teachers and school personnel stay aware of what's happening in the home. Be mindful of what's happening to each of our children and be prepared for what they'll need once they return to school. Expectations should be clear and attainable. Be mindful of frequent reminders around rules and social norms. And as previously mentioned, you should expect regression and setbacks both behaviorally and academically. For high-risk populations, given the availability of resources in your specific district, make sure you have routine crisis intervention and other necessary strategies in place to manage high-risk behaviors as needed. It's important that when we're reestablishing routine to be mindful to bring all members into play. Make sure that every school staff member has training and knowledge around the potential impacts of trauma, both generally and from this pandemic, to increase relationships and partnerships with school counselors and social workers, and possibly even establish routine groups and classroom push-in services as needed. Finally, the school should be prepared for an increased need or request for RTI, 504, or IEP services. Once kids return, students of all ages will benefit from the implementation of direct interventions in managing stress. Students can use ways to de-escalate before becoming overwhelmed, and having these strategies be provided to them from a trusted adult will increase healthy help seeking. In some categories of direct interventions are direct stress reducers, such as meditation, mindfulness, having easy access to balls and fidgets in the classroom, utilizing deep breathing, group meditation, and other ways to de-stress before the students become overwhelmed. Using breaks can also be an effective way to manage both engagement and difficult behavior. Students at risk should take breaks or check in with support staff as needed. Of course, breaks will have to be monitored to make sure that they're not being used for task avoidant purposes. However, we know that breaks can be a great way to reduce stress. You should prepare your students for transitions or change throughout the day as they come up. It's going to be necessary for kids who struggle with rigidity and control, and using multiple cues such as visual, verbal, or kinetic to prepare students will improve their ability to manage transition. And finally, be sure that the student always knows what he or she is supposed to be doing. Not only what they're doing right now, but what they're going to be doing next. And of course, make these expectations manageable, attainable, and realistic. I understand and appreciate the need to maintain academic expectations, but we have to prepare ourselves to have a willingness to flex expectations to meet the individual needs of our students. When using interventions to manage difficult behavior, it's necessary to be creative. Interventions can be used to prevent difficult behaviors, to reward positive behaviors, to redirect students away from conflict, to set expectations for work, and to encourage engagement in all classroom activities. Some examples of direct interventions with setting expectations is allow alternate response modes, give clear, concise instructions, provide a predictable routine, and set realistic standards for acceptable work. Direct interventions for redirection may look like allowing choice of tasks, bringing distractors or toys when appropriate, and alternating seat-based activities with more physical activity. Indirect interventions for rewarding good behavior might be using activity as a reward, positively praising success and effort, and encouraging students to match with those who may serve as positive role models. Using direct interventions to increase engagement can look like allowing students to stand while doing seat work, encouraging non-disruptive movement, having a child repeat directions to you out loud, encouraging after-school activities, decreasing the length of tasks assigned, breaking up tasks into smaller parts, and alternating high and low interest tasks. One of the most effective direct interventions that can be used is mindfulness in the classroom. Mindfulness benefits students of all ages, of all developmental abilities, and especially of students with trauma when done in a supportive, safe environment. Mindfulness has been shown empirically and anecdotally to improve behavioral functioning, focus, and academic progress. Mindful practice helps slow students' overactivated stress response by moderating breath, grounding to the safe presence of the classroom, pulling thoughts away from stressful trauma reminders, and moderating body and brain needs for learning. In order for mindfulness to be effective, the classroom environment must be a safe space for our students. Work on coordinating with your academic team on how to improve emotional safety for our most vulnerable students. Examples of mindfulness are guided imagery, meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, and other relaxing and grounding strategies. Another super effective direct intervention, especially for our younger kiddos, is play. Play offers students the opportunity to build characteristics associated with resilience. They're constructing an identity. They receive respite from difficult life circumstances. They're making friends. They're creating meaningful experiences. And play puts a positive spin on their day in the classroom and reduces fear associated with learning. Play should never be taken away as a consequence for difficult behavior, because play is a necessary tool that helps ground and calm the stress response in our most vulnerable students. The use of expressive art has also been shown to be beneficial in the learning environment. Creativity can unlock new resources for managing stress, solving problems, and expressing needs. Our students who struggle at verbalizing what it is that they need benefit significantly from creative processing. And when we use a creative process to see the root of a problem in a different light, it stimulates alpha waves that correlate with raising serotonin levels, decreasing anxiety. And it helps our neural systems that produce a wide range of benefits, from fine motor skills to emotion management. Find ways to incorporate your already established art department in collaboration around ways to use expressive art in the classroom. One of the most universally beneficial direct interventions, especially following trauma, is movement. When we are in an increase of arousal and our fight or flight system is activated, this results in an increased anxiety, increased carbon dioxide in our blood, and the anxious energy must be expelled from our body in some way. On the other hand, when we are in a state of shutdown, our body must be activated to pull ourselves back up to optimum calm arousal. One of the best ways to do that is to incorporate movement during times of distress. For decades, the educational and scientific community seemed to believe that thinking was thinking and movement was movement, and they were inherently unrelated to each other. Today, however, we know there's a strong connection between cognition and movement. First off, aerobic and anaerobic activity increases plasticity in the frontal lobe, meaning the more we move, the more we expel anxious energy from our body, and the more oxygen-rich blood that flows to the areas of our brain necessary for learning. Breaks for recess and other energizing activities have been shown to lead to improved cognition, to strengthen learning, improve memory retrieval, and to reduce energizing chemicals in the body. Interesting enough, movement also allows learners to make more mistakes without significant consequences, as there tends to be far less embarrassment associated with fun and movement-based learning as opposed to traditional classroom situations. This improves the child's ability to handle stress by training the body to recover faster from increases of adrenaline. Physical activity also triggers the release of the brain-derived neurotropic factor, and this substance enhances the thinking neurons' ability to communicate with each other. And finally, movement may also release norepinephrine and dopamine to elevate and energize low moods. Finding ways to incorporate movement in the classroom can be difficult. As students get older, they typically have less options for movement-based learning, but some ways that exercise can be incorporated include solitary play during breaks, standing stretch activities, exploratory play, walking excursions, adventure play, and competitive games, and other ways to get movement in the classroom. Be creative on how you can get our students moving. Once we return to normalcy, we should expect an increased focus on trauma-informed educational practices. The first aspect of this educational style is to increase staff education, making sure that all staff know of signs and symptoms to look for among students who are expressing significant signs of toxic stress. In addition, increasing student education, so our students are aware of their own emotional responses and needs, can be essential in their help-seeking ability. And as previously discussed, you want to make sure that we're using a wide range of direct interventions in ways that are meaningful and appropriate to your specific students. We want to be engaged in a community action to make sure we're aware of what local community resources exist regarding mental health, social needs, and crisis support services. And finally, we want to work with families to develop lasting relationships so that they know they can trust the school to meet their needs. I encourage you to identify ways that you can carry trauma-informed educational practices into your school culture and milieu as we prepare for the changes that are ultimately going to come following this crisis. Remember to take care of yourself. We are in an international state of inconvenience, uncertainty, and worry. If you are struggling, it is okay, it is normal, and it is expected. If you have the ability to offer help and support to others, do as you can. But be flexible with yourself and be forgiving of others, and remember that this is temporary. If you have any questions or you would like to contact me for further information, feel free to do so as my personal email address is attached. If you are interested in receiving helpful links for websites that provide beneficial information around COVID-19 and the impact that it has on our functioning in education, feel free to reach out. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope that you're able to take away the importance of identifying trauma for our students and families. Hopefully, I'll talk to you all again soon.